And a lot of people will just watch it later, so you don't have to worry too much about interacting in the midst of it.
Okay.
All right. Back over here.
How's your family, by the way, Rody?
Yeah, good man. Krista is wearing a boot because she hurt her foot.
I didn't
Uh,
know that.
yeah, so she's in a little bit of pain, but other than that, we're all good. It's just a little extra work for me. A little bit of mopping and cooking and all that. It's all right. We'll survive.
I told him, I said, hey,
Absolutely.
how's Steph?
She's doing all right. Her life is full of the girls and all sorts of other little project stuff. So, but things have been good. I mean, it's just going a little bit crazy in the middle of COVID, not being able to do anything else,
Yeah,
which has not been good for the kiddos. As you know, it's kind of hard on them.
makes it a challenge for sure.
So it's crazy. So
And your oldest is how old now?
she's 3.5, and almost 3.5, and then our youngest is a year and a half.
Okay.
So yeah, yep, that's a crazy life there because they don't do much else. Uh,
No, that's those are some tough ages in some different ways.
yeah, they are. It's nuts. Well, I think we're now live, starting to be joined with people on 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 YouTube Live. So let me do a formal introduction, and I'll see if I can bow out of here. Um, all right, let's do it. Well, welcome everyone. It is good to be here with you again as we discuss the movie Just Mercy. For those of you who have been along with us, I think we're now in about the fifth week of doing this. And the format is to consider a film, a movie or a documentary, and then discuss it together from a Christian perspective, and a justice perspective. Not that they're mutually exclusive in any way, but really focusing it on race justice in the church tonight. Joined by my friend Arodi Sanchez, a coworker, one of the pastors at Rock Church, also on staff with us at Rock Inc. and the nonprofit here in the 10th Street community, underprivileged community, a multicultural community in Oklahoma City. And my friend, our friend Levi Jones, who's pastoring in St. Paul's in Kansas City and working at NTS, Nazarene Theological Seminary. And we've known Levi for a while, grew up in Oklahoma, lived in our neighborhood at some point in his life, and now pastoring in his own multicultural setting, really in the more of the urban core of Kansas City. So, Levi, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this conversation tonight. And I'm going to turn it over to you guys. I'm going to ask this question and then turn it over to you guys and try to bow out of the screen here so that people can focus on your conversation. But as you watch Just Mercy, what initially hits you, stands out to you? What kind of thing? What kind of things does the movie itself evoke in you? Your basic gut responses to it, and how does that start to lead you into your own thoughts about justice, race, and the church?
Well, I gotta say, it was the feeling was the feeling that was described everything I had throughout the movie was a strong sense of frustration. Frustration for not seeing the truth for what it is, right? For not taking the facts of the case, not looking at a human being uh, as a person worthy of justice and equality, but as a person that deserved in the minds of many deserved less simply because of the color of his skin. In this case, was Mr. Walter Macmillan, and to me, that was throughout the movie. It was almost like this knot that I could even sense physically in me that kept getting tighter and tighter, almost as this suffocating pressure of not being able to. I mean, this is a man's life we're talking about, and that is clearly innocent, and and so to me it was such a what they call justice. To me was completely the opposite. What people were calling for justice, like this guy needs to die because he did this, and for me was completely the opposite, just completely oppressive and against this whole concept that justice is blind, right? It's almost like we have this idea of Lady Justice with a blindfold, and in my mind, it's almost like she actually is picking, lifting up the blindfold and picking through to see who it is that I'm gonna judge to determine. Because it is that's how I felt. Like, who is it that I'm gonna do it? Oh, it's a black man. There's a different set of standards for this individual. Uh, um, just to think that this happened right now in our lifetime and it keeps happening. This is not something that happened 200 years ago. These people are, well, Mr. McMillan passed away, but Brian Stevenson is still alive and well. He lived through this, and many people still continue to live through this kind of uh, very flagrant injustices. And to me, what I got, all I could say is just frustration, and that will lead to anger and wanted to get into the into the situation and see and say how could you be so blind, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my gut reaction.
Yeah. The word that comes to mind for me is gut wrenching. Just to see these situations that include very specific lives that are being impacted. It puts it on a whole different level in terms of its, one's ability to relate to how systemic issues can impact individuals in their lives, their families, the ripple effect of all of that, how it spreads out into the community. One of the things that it kind of brought to my mind as Brian keeps kind of finding these roadblocks to getting a fair trial, as he's trying to fight the system, even though in a movie you have a pretty good sense of it's going to probably end in a good way. Mm-hmm. Throughout the whole movie, you get this really sense of almost like how do you beat something that is so big and it's overwhelming. How do you, especially as a small group like Brian's Equal Justice Initiative that's starting out and just getting started, how in the world do you fight something that is so big and massive when you have so little resources in comparison and you have so little backing in comparison? And for me, even just this happened. He was arrested before I was born, but he was in prison for much of my young life, and so again, this is not ancient history. So I immediately began thinking about all those who have been incarcerated because of a system that is targeting Black bodies and brown bodies. And if you look at the history of racism, the way that it tends to operate is whenever it's confronted, it doesn't go away. It just becomes more subtle in the way that it manifests itself. So chattel slavery, that was, for the very first parts of the country's history, when it was confronted and sort of stopped, then it became Jim Crow segregation. And that went on for a time until it became unbearable. And then that was kind of put to a stop. Well, it morphed into what's called mass incarceration. Mm-hmm. So you have these different kinds of processes where what is systemic targeting of Black and brown bodies and enslavement of those bodies, it becomes more subtle in its manifestation. And so really what Walter experiences is kind of the more modern form of slavery. And so, I think the question for me throughout is, well, okay, what does it mean, especially as a pastor, as somebody who works with those that would be impacted by these kinds of realities, and people I love and deeply care about. What is my responsibility in this moment, especially when sometimes I feel like I have such a small voice in comparison to the injustices that seem to be so big and powerful.
It is very interesting, and we see what we see in this movie that I think is very genius. It is these issues and this conflict and the clashes of people of different color or different social status or different occupations. uh, you see it in different levels, right? You see the hatred that happens against the lady that was helping Mr. Stevenson, the one lady that sort of hosted him in and welcomed him in. You saw there was hatred right there. You saw the hostility happening in when he went to the prison to visit Mr. McMillan for the first time. They didn't believe he was a lawyer, right? And how they treated him. You see you see hostility with the police officers, with the sheriff, and you see with the people in the community. You see they should do a great job of showing every dimension of society how this is affecting everyone, and how you sense that pressure, and how Mr. Stevenson he was able to experience that pressure everywhere. Not everybody could experience have that experience with the police department or with the district attorney, but he was able to experience it in every single level. And sometimes, so how what do you think that speaks to in terms of how we find ourselves encountering? Sometimes we can experience it in this one dimension when the reality is multiple of it. Like, how does that speak to the reality of us as individual encountering uh, this hatred and these prejudices and racist systems, and how is the reality with in the other dimensions of society? What does that make you feel? What does that make you think? What do you think from that?
Well, a lot of times when I have any sort of conversations around this, especially around people that are white people, a lot of times the kind of things that I hear are, well, I have black friends or black coworkers, or I had black students growing up. I'm not racist, and part of, I think, the way that language operates, we think of racism only as hatred,
Mm,
but racism is actually something much bigger than that. Hatred is connected to racism sometimes, but not always like directly. Hatred is a byproduct.
that's it.
Racism really is rooted in greed. It's rooted in the ability to dictate what happens to land, what happens to property, what happens to sort of monetary resources and
Mm,
an opportunity. And so the incarceration and the enslavement was really about the ability to control money, control land, control property, all those kinds of things. Now, when you go further along to justify that kind of enslavement of people, you have to sort of justify it theologically or politically, like it's a necessary evil, or in scripture, it talks about having slaves, so therefore it must be okay. So there's all sorts of justification for that. And now that we don't have quote unquote slavery in the same way that we used to, we would say, well, obviously then racism isn't a problem anymore because I don't hate people. But the problem with that is that racism is much more about the policies and practices and ideas that have inculcated themselves in communities and societies that continue to prevent people from having access to the same kinds of opportunities, the same kinds of resources. So, even in the 60s and 70s and 80s, although you didn't have slavery per se, you still had things like redlining, which limited where Black families could move if they could get loans for houses. So It created a poverty section, ghettoized Black bodies in communities. In Kansas City, where I live, it prevented bus lines from going east to west, which meant that Black people did not have the same access to jobs in the inner cities or in the suburbs. So that was very intentional. Troost was a racial dividing line quite seriously. And so when we think of racism, we tend to think of it only in terms of the hatred rather than the support of policies and practices. And even, I think even implicitly, sometimes this gets sort of operational in our lives without even being paying attention. So if I could give a real quick example of a way that it impacted me, for instance. I was playing basketball in college outside outside hoops. And this basketball, 2 goals, all that kind of stuff, had a huge chain link fence, about 12-foot chain link fence that surrounded the courts, and only one exit out of this court. And as I was playing, I happened to be the only white guy on the court. About that time, as we had been playing for a few minutes, there was a truck full of white guys that came around yelling all sorts of racial slurs at the Black guys that I was playing ball with. And so, they're starting to yell back and forth their groups. Well, the Black guys had moved towards the exit and I had not. So I literally am, all the Black men are between me and the exit. Now, I wasn't joining in and yelling the obscenities. I wasn't being hateful in that way. But my reaction, the very first thing I thought is, oh no, I'm a white guy stuck in a cage with Black guys who are hearing all these words. They're going to turn around and beat me up. So my internalized racism automatically thought of them as being violent towards me, even though I hadn't done anything and they had given me no reason to think they would do anything to me. That's how racism can be really subtle in the way that it manifests itself. And that's kind of the way I was thinking in some of these stories. It's not just like the sheriff that's the problem or the lawyer. It's the townspeople that have embodied some of this and don't challenge the systems or don't question it and continue to live quietly, not really asking questions of these kinds of realities.
My friend Kendall Hughes has taught me something. He's always said many people are in prison or are racist or do evil because there is somebody else that validates such behavior and validate such thinking. This kind of systemic racism doesn't occur in a silo, doesn't occur in an individualistic manner. It's because there's a group of people that validate it as true and correct and justified. So as I've been studying and thinking a lot through this, it's almost like this natural progression from bias, right? We're all biased. Bias is like a belly button. Everybody's got one. Right? You go from bias to then what if you remain on that bias, it can turn into prejudice. And then when that prejudice expands to build a system that supports my prejudice and my biases, then that is racism. Then that is a collective systemic situation that society supports. And I think this movie portrays that. This movie, based on the book, by the way, and this is a real life story. This is not something that somebody just made up. This actually happened. This is something that it is completely supported by society, and it's almost like they prop one another up. It is almost like it's a system that is built to continue to allow those who have the power and the resources to continue to have it, and those who do not have it, the have-nots, not to have it. Right. And I think that is a very troublesome reality, and a reality that the prophets all throughout the scriptures talked about the haves and haves not, and the big divide of the big gap of the haves and have not. So I think it is a very powerful situation.
Yeah. It tends to be cyclical in terms of its ability to sort of self-support itself. It becomes a closed system that can't be challenged. or if it is challenged, then you're either hushed up or done away with, or imprisoned or whatever. But it begins with the domination of a particular people group and the resources that are available to them, land, capital, all that kind of stuff. And then the justification, well, we're more civilized. We're trying to civilize them. We're trying to even Christianly talking, we're trying to make them Christian. We're trying to make them better. So there's those kind of justifications as to why we should be able to dominate them, like a manifest destiny. And then when you begin to think that you're better than them, or that you have more power than them, and you should have that kind of power, then it can turn into that sort of prejudice, hatred piece. And then when that hatred piece is there, you don't need any further justification. It's already completed the cycle. So then you can create policies that allow you to maintain control over the resources and the land and and even the bodies. So that's that cycle that continues to go. And when you begin to interrupt those pieces in the cycle, it finds itself really difficult to hold together. So when you have, Brian Stevens, for instance, really beginning to pick at those realities in different kinds of ways, you see the initial reaction is anger, vitriolic, violent, any sort of aggression. And that's what happens when you have a system that is broken and evil. And sinful, when it becomes questioned, it will often lash out to either try to silence you to go along with everything, or to, like Jesus, to kill you, crucify you.
Yeah.
That's why the prophets are often killed.
That's the truth. And it just how I was so intrigued about how the district attorney specifically wanted to maintain the status quo. And there's a wonderful, he has several conversations with them, and he tells them, you are not, your job is not to be right. Your point is to make justice happen, to make sure that there is justice delivered. It's not about being right. And it speaks tremendously about the pride that it is to say that I am right and you're wrong because this is how we have always done it. This is how I have accepted it, right? It is incredible the level of pride that there was to admit by the sheriff and by the district attorney and many others in the town or whatnot, or even the first judge and that they dealt with. Mm-hmm. They said, well, we have done it, it's done, and we're not going back, right? So it spoke to me a lot about the pride is deeply embedded as well in this systemic evil of racism and injustice when it comes to incarceration, right? It is not the pride of not saying I was wrong, or the pride of not admitting, you know what, this was a racially profile, motivated arrest. And to admit that it takes true humility, and to admit that, and nobody wants that, right? So that impacted me a lot, the pride that was with these people of power,
Right. Yeah, I think you probably agree with me on this. I think probably the first part or really the first step in addressing racism has to be with confession. And we both do that. I think we do that as a community, but we also need to do that personally. To say, kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous, right? It doesn't matter if you've been there 5 years, 5 minutes. You start out the same way, no matter where you're at in the process. Hi, my name is Levi, and I'm an alcoholic. Well, I think in some ways we kind of begin this journey in the same way. Hi, my name is Levi, and I'm a racist. That doesn't mean I'm a hateful intent. Sometimes that's true, but it's not really about me being intentionally racist all the time. I've been shaped and formed by this community and this kind of way of thinking and living. And as the gospel has called me to this life with Christ, that means that I have to be reoriented in a different way. So these intentional practices begin with confession, to say, I've messed up. And the next step becomes trying to find ways of bringing restitution and reconciliation, and not just being passive as just to say, because I've said it, therefore I don't have to do anything else. Rather, now I have to start working actively against the systems that oppress my brother and sister, as MLK would say, in finding the freedom of my brother and sister who has been enslaved to this system. I find my own freedom as well. And so there's this mutuality, this reciprocal kind of nature of freedom, that as I participate in the work and redemption of all creation, I find I'm being redeemed by the Creator, as well. So my freedom is bound up in the freedom of others.
Man, that is very powerful. And we were having this conversation the same about right? That people that people think is this like uh, this game that is just, hey, if you have my rights, you're taking away. If you have equal rights, you're taking away from my rights. Would you talk a little bit about that, as we had a conversation earlier on that?
Yeah, it seems like we almost treat it like a competition, that if somebody gains rights, somehow I lose out.
Mhm.
And because of that, it's a war of attrition. It's kind of consumeristic. So it's that becomes a power game, right? Well, if somebody's going to gain something and I don't gain in the same kind of way, then eventually I'm going to lose all privileges, or I'm going to lose all rights, or however you want to frame that. The problem is I think that the way that life actually operates is not fundamentally about rights, it's about a gift. And the gift is the God who has given us life, has given us creation, has shaped us to be made in the image of God. I mean, this is a gift. And the thing about a gift is it can continuously be given. When you hoard a gift that God has given, you tend to lose it. So this idea that because somebody gains something, I somehow lose out is not, it's not the way of Jesus. Jesus would talk about to one who is excuse me, let me reframe that. Jesus would often talk about the freedom of other people. Like, think about Luke 4. He goes and talks about setting people free, the captive free. He talks about the year of the Lord's favor. Uh, Understanding that as people are gaining in some kind of freedom, as they are being released from oppression and all those kinds of things, actually, everybody wins in that scenario. So I think that's what gift is all about. Like grace is all about that. There's not a limit to God's grace. And so if somebody receives God's grace, we should celebrate that, because in recognizing that as they receive, we receive in the same kind of way. We participate in that. It's a reciprocal kind of thing. As we forgive, we are forgiven. It's the reciprocal nature of I think the way that God has created the world. So when we're talking about rights and so worried about what we lose out on, and try to prevent or hold back from others also having the same kinds of opportunities, or being seen as fully human, we lose out as well, because eventually, as we denigrate another person's humanity, it's very easy for us to then have others to denigrate our own sort of humanity, and nobody wins in that.
Absolutely. And you touch a little bit on how the gospel fits into this, what does the gospel have to say to this issue? But it is unavoidable to talk about the death penalty and the gospel. This is the irony of it. Uh, Jesus, first and foremost, always, the Sermon on the Mountain says it very clear. Not only you ought to respect or give the same dignity to those who persecute you, but you gotta pray for your enemies. Love your enemies. I mean, this is the message of Jesus. And Jesus himself treated those who were ostracized, who were in the minds of the Romans less than, right? I mean, you see even those, people that, like the zealots, there were zealots in Jesus' group, people that were considered criminals and were crucified. And obviously Jesus himself being sentenced to death by a system that was inherently unfair and broken, and killing a man that was innocent. So I think that the irony It's for us as Christians in the gospel, especially in light of the cross and in light of Jesus Christ. It begs us, it calls us to reflect on this idea of reconsideration. How do we treat those who are in death penalty? How do we support this such thing? And how do we go to as believers, as believers, that the Son of God was crucified, and he willingly took it, he willingly did so. But it is not that God said, hey, I'm gonna it's okay to
Right.
kill somebody that is innocent. It's not. It is that actually is a reflection of our own evil, of our own brokenness. It's not okay, and that is what the cross shows us. And it shows us that even though it's not okay, even though that it's broken, it doesn't have the ultimate word. Injustice and death doesn't have the ultimate word. But it calls us to see and to reflect how we treat those who are incarcerated, who are on death row. Would it be possible to see these people like with the eyes of Jesus? You know, and as we have seen, many of those who are on death row are innocent, like Macmillan was, and one of the inmates there that wasn't released until about 10 years ago, also was innocent. So right. There is that idea that, again, there's that the pride has to be set aside. I understand. Number one, we can be wrong, and number two, do we truly value life and the dignity as we are all children of God? Do we truly see all people as children of God, worth of dignity and respect? And man, the deathbed of the situation here is, I mean, it's just right on our faces.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you mentioned, we have Jesus who is falsely accused and killed, essentially put on death row, right? He is a criminal by the standards of that society, and he's crucified for it. James Cone says that in the person of Jesus, God is counted among the lynched peoples of the world. And I think that's a really powerful image for talking about the reality of the gospel, that God is not one who comes in power, but comes in the most subtle of ways, in a carpenter, you know, in the kind of the run-of-the-mill kind of people. That's who God comes as, and in doing so, finds himself in some sense, in some way, kind of at the mercy of a system that is built on injustice and power and domination and controlling land, controlling the access to power and money. And because you know, Jesus isn't killed for being nice. Jesus is killed for commenting and challenging a system that's very broken and that doesn't work for everybody. It's why it's a scandal that he heals on the Sabbath, because he restores people to access to the community and to life, to being able to have opportunity. That's not okay for those who want to control access to everything. And then when you get, I think we should really pay attention as Christians. Willie James Jennings wrote a wonderful commentary on the book of Acts. The book of Acts spends a majority of its time following the disciples of Jesus in and out of prison, as people who are, in some sense, innocent, but yet also guilty. They are literally guilty of sedition. They're guilty of breaking the laws of that day. And yet, as we read those stories now, in light of who Christ is and who we're called to be as a church, we'd say they're justified in law breaking. They're justified in challenging the system. They're justified in proclaiming hope and proclaiming Christ. And yet, I think we tend to lose the setting that they are imprisoned and, in Paul's case, on death row. And so I think that should give us pause to think about, you know, what does it mean to have a justice system? What does it mean to have a prison system? And especially for those that will often find themselves at the mercy of that justice system because they don't have access to money and therefore access to lawyers, that they don't have, you know, the lawyers are overwhelmed with their work, and so they can't give time and attention to one specific individual, and so things slip through the crack, and they find themselves in dire straits. They find themselves in a similar situation as Walter. For instance, there is a 15-year-old who she's a black female, a 15-year-old student who has been in prison for 3 months for not doing her homework. Um, that's problematic. Just for not doing her homework. Is homework important? Yes. Should we encourage her to do it? Yes. Do we want her to have success? Yes. Should she be spending does 3 months in prison help her to do her homework or to be sick? No,
absolutely no.
Now she has a criminal record because of it. There's all sorts of fallout that comes out of that. So what does it mean as the church then to be a voice of justice, a voice confronting those kinds of realities? When we have systems that are targeting specific people, especially the poor, but also those that are black and brown bodies in even greater numbers than what their numbers are in society. That's problematic.
And look, in a personal, going back to this idea of how we have experiences, you talked about your experience playing basketball. I was able to somewhat experience the justice system with a gentleman who he had some misdemeanors and he had done some wrong things, but it took it. I spent 3 years, listen, 2.5 years taking this man to court 45 minutes away for things to spin around and not to happen. He couldn't keep a job because he had to go there. Sometimes they would tell him the day before and he would just last minute have to call me and say, can you take me there 45 minutes away? Because he couldn't afford to pay $5,000 for a lawyer to get it over with. This man at one point said, I'd rather they just lock me up. Listen, I'd rather than lock me up to get it over with. That is troublesome. That is troublesome. And also, I have I have that experience with somebody else, but I had other experience that it could be me that is confronted with the law, or it could be me that who face some criminal record or even say a police infraction simply because of somebody sees me and judges me. It happened just right here in Oklahoma just a few months ago. I was pulled over because supposedly I stepped over the yellow line in the middle of the road. And he yelled at me. He didn't say his name. He didn't say who he was or why he was pulling me over. He just was short with me and told me that, right? At that moment, I'm scared for my life. At that moment, I'm putting my hands on the steering wheel and I'm shaking, thinking, what is this man going to do? I haven't done anything wrong. And he's yelling at me and he's angry at me because I touched the yellow line in the middle of the road. And he says, this is terrible and it's doing this thing to me. So these experiences over and over and over, our experiences that one way or another can lead, for some people has led to incarceration, for some people has led to death, and when you see those who are facing that situation, when we see those who face those situations that have been incarcerated or charged of any criminal charges, society tends to write them off, right? Society tends to say, oh, that's who you are. You were charged with this or you were convicted by this. Even if you were convicted, again, we have seen it, there have been wrong convictions. So even when you're convicted, we believe immediately this person is all that this person is. My friend Kendall Hughes, who was a chaplain in the federal prison for about 28 years, he has seen, guards, in the prison saying, why are you treating nice this person, chaplain? They're inmates, they're dogs, they're animals. They don't treat them like human because immediately, oh, you're here, you're locked up, you deserve it. You don't deserve anything else. And that is the extent of who you are and nothing else.
Right.
And that is extremely troublesome. And many people with them to justify it, to say, well, this person broke the law. Oh, it is the law. But then there's an issue, again, as we talk, there's an issue, this racism and evil and prejudice embedded in the law itself.
Right.
So, so I, in, another way that I experienced this is when I was talking about, uh, say, some policies that will completely hurt international students. Some people, I talked about this issue. I have been an international student, and I said, hey, this is a problem. This is not good, and this is why. And the answer from so many people was, well, it's the law. Well, okay, it was also the law for the Nazis to do what they did. It was also the law for the Romans to crucify Jesus. So for us believers, the ultimate truth is not it's not the ultimate truth for us is not the laws that a society establishes, but the ultimate truth is the gospel of Christ. What does the gospel of Christ? What does the cross tell us about this issue? Right. And I think we got to be confronted with the cross over and over and over when it comes to the laws. I'm not advocating for breaking the law, just like Paul didn't advocate for that. He said, in all things, do peace. And yet he was saying that while he was incarcerated in prison. Mm-hmm. Right. So you have to understand that we are not citizens of this world. Our citizenship, our ultimate allegiance is with Jesus Christ. And so we cannot use that argument of, well, it is the law, right? It is the law. And when the law itself has been embedded by systemic evil, whether of all kinds of prejudice against people of different social, economic, or people that have done something in the past. Yes, it was a mistake, but this is not the totality of this individual. And this is something that we need to reflect and think about.
Yeah, and in fact, in some of the ways that criminals are often labeled with language, beast, animals, all that, that's rooted in a very deep racist history, which African Americans and Native Americans, for that matter, yes, were often named as being beast-like, animal-like, and so this was a way of sort of denigrating their capacity for intelligent thought and all that kind of stuff. And so because they were labeled that, they could be treated as subhuman, not human. And I think in terms of like the prison system, even if somebody is guilty of doing, even a heinous crime, as Christians, I do think we have an opportunity to say, even in the midst of that, for like Paul, for instance, Paul was a killer of Christians. And yet we celebrate the fact that God found him in the midst of his brokenness and transformed his life and reoriented it. And I think in the same thing, even in prison systems, rather than treating people as animals that are just simply to be caged and forgotten, to see that even in their brokenness, that God's grace can reach them, God's grace can transform them. But the way that happens has to be through human engagement, interaction, and by seeing even the gift in the brokenness, seeing even the human aspects, even in the midst of the things that have broken them to the place where perhaps they are almost like, we cage people and they start to believe that about themselves. So what if we began to provide a different kind of narrative and story to say, I've made mistakes too, but God forgives. God loves you. God is able to do something new in you. This is not the end of the story. And despite you having even a criminal record, even if it is true, that is not the total, like you said, Rody, that's not the totality of who you are in the eyes of the church or in the eyes of God. And I think sometimes as the church, we've got to go back to that and remember we are also sinners saved by grace. And there's plenty of, dark spots in our lives that have are complicated and broken. But even in that, we are willing to forgive ourselves or willing to give ourselves grace or to say we can be transformed. Why can we not extend that to others? Jesus even did that on the cross to the two that were hanging beside him. And if Christ, who came bearing all grace, can do the same kind of thing to even criminals hanging on a cross with him, though he was innocent, surely as the church, we are called to do that same kind of reconciliation work, even in prison systems.
Fantastic. This is great. A great segue to this final question about how we as the church engage this issue with compassion and justice. And you touch a little bit on this in regards to confession, and you're talking now on regards to advocacy. I really appreciate the ministry of one of our pastors here, Pastor Becky Berry, who is a strong advocate for ladies who are incarcerated. She goes out there and is participates in a strong ministry, and she oftentimes, when she has the opportunity, reminds us of the importance of praying for these people, of treating these people the way that Jesus would want us to treat them, people that are human beings worth of dignity and love. And man, there is the strong sense that we got confession, but that we need to practice so that we are reminded we are no better than those people. But we also got this advocacy, and we see a lot of advocacy, especially precisely with Saul of Tarsus, later known as Paul, right? Saul of Tarsus shows up, and the believers don't want anything to do with him.
Yeah, right.
Let's remember this, folks. So we're not trying to pretend this is easy. We're not trying to pretend that this speaks, I think, a lot. Because here's the thing: Saul of Tarsus did heinous crimes, terrible crimes, but he was never convicted for them. He was never convicted for the crimes that he did. If there were crimes that were terrible, but they were upheld by the law at that point. But there were still crimes. There were terrible things that he did. So people see this person, imagine how they feel. Imagine, hey, this guy's coming to us, he's going to get us, right? And yet, there was a guy, Barnabas had to be an advocate for him, had to vouch for him. So I think that teaches us a lot about those who are incarcerated and those that is even in a very important and strong way, those who are released from incarceration. Right. Do they have an advocate? Do they have somebody that will vouch for them? Do they have somebody in the church that said, hey, this person is a child of God. Let's love him. Let's love her. Let's support her. Let's support him. That's not all who they are. I think that is something that is lacking tremendously in the churches today. Is there an advocate for those who are in prison and are released from prison? That could, for many of them, it can be even a greater challenge to find a job, to find somebody to give you a chance, to be able to register for voting again and even get an ID. There was a man that got released from prison a few months ago, and he came here and he said, I got released from prison after 4 years, and they didn't even give me a bologna sandwich. I didn't have nothing, nowhere to go. I mean, who's the advocate for these people? Right. So the church, I think we have failed on this, and I think this is a practice that the church needs to come. The practice of Barnabas, being that person that stands in the gap and say, hey, this person has seen Christ. They have met Christ now. He's one of us. She is one of us. So confession and advocacy I think, is part of are two strong aspects of ministry to those incarcerated or formerly incarcerated that we need to recover.
Yeah, I agree. And I would probably add, in terms of the advocacy, if you think of like the story of what Brian Stevens does, I mean, he's a lawyer, so like he can sort of clock his time and be gone, right? He can show up to the court date, he can provide the files, he can do all that kind of stuff, he can make the arguments in court and then cut out and be done. But he understands that in order to begin to fight this system and to really understand the case and to even have compassion requires the relational element. So he not only gets to know Walter on a personal level, he then gets the community involved and begins to know the circle of support that Walter has. So, I think in terms of what the church is really called to do in a lot of ways, not all of us are lawyers, so there's limitations in terms of what we can do with the law at times or other sorts of things. But one of the things that we do have as a gift is our presence and getting to know people. So, not just knowing the crime, but what's the story? What is the story of this person? What are the pains? What are the hopes and the joys? Who are the people that are surrounding them? Their family, all those kinds of things. I think as you begin to take that kind of deep interest in a person and learn the story, sometimes it even contextualizes that crime. Sometimes, even just something as simple as, I was trying to feed my family, or I got caught up in the wrong thing at the wrong time, or there, whatever it is, you start to kind of understand what's led to these sorts of situations where they find themselves in a tough bind. Sometimes it's because the systems put it there. Sometimes it's because their family situation kind of put them there, and there was no other options. So finding the stories, listening to them, spending time, I think then you can begin to also do the advocacy work that you're talking about, Rody. Like, what are the real needs? Sometimes, yeah, money is the thing that we think of as the need, but is it the job that you need? Is something that's going to be able to support long term? Those kinds of things. So even thinking broader than just the momentary kinds of ways we think of helping somebody.
So, Liva, I wanted to talk a little bit because you mentioned confession and to expand on confession. And in regards to the objection that many people have, like, well, I have nothing to confess. I am not racist. I didn't put this person in prison. I didn't beat this person up with clubs. I mean, I didn't do it. Why should I confess? Why should I confess the sins of others if I only need to confess my own personal and individual sins? So what do you think? Why so? What do you say to that objection of corporate confession?
Yeah, well, so when you look at scripture as a whole, it's when it talks about sin and talks about injustice, it tends to think of it corporately, communally, not just individually. Yes, the individual is part of that, but that's not the whole. And so it talks about the ways that the community as a whole has shed blood. The community as a whole has been greedy and has sinned against the foreigner, the orphan, the widow, the outcast. And so, the way that scripture often talks about, and even Jesus talks about the ideas of sin and salvation, is it's a communal aspect. And so because I participate in a society, because I have been given certain traditions and practices and language, I participate in society as a whole, sometimes very small ways, but I'm still complicit in what goes on. And so, for instance, I'm wearing Nike shorts. These are shorts that I bought when I was in college as like a 20-year-old. Okay. So that was like 15 years ago. I bought them at a Ross store because they were on sale and I liked them. I got them for like $15. So they were cheap. So, college student, cheap and good. Um, Nike has a practice of paying people overseas very little money and then taking their products and marking it up very high and making a massive amount of money. I'm complicit in the practices of that company. I didn't know that at the time when I bought them, but that doesn't mean that just because I didn't know that my practices and participation in society as a whole didn't in some way impact another person negatively. It's they're living on pennies. Some of them are making 60 some cents a day, if that. And so, because I'm part of this larger society, I have to also say I'm partly responsible for things that go on. Sometimes because I turn a blind eye, sometimes because I'm an active participant. But part of what confession is this ongoing reality that, like Isaiah, I am a person of unclean lips and I live among a people of unclean lips. And therefore, in being confronted with the holy presence of God, my only response can really be I am in need of God's grace. I am in need of God's healing. And as I have been confronted with my own complicity, my own sin, and the society I live within, God then calls me to be somebody who goes and proclaims new life, new hope, new vision for reality. That's the life of the church. That's what God has called us to do. That's what confession leads us to do. And in talking like about John Wesley, for instance, when he talks about Christian perfection, maybe a better word would be Christian perfecting. In other words, it's a maturing grace, not that we have already attained these things, as Paul said,
Yeah.
but we are being transformed from glory to glory. And so there's this reality that I have not yet accomplished these things. Any holiness that I might claim for myself is but dirty rags before God. And so there's this ongoing need to recognize that even if I'm on the way, I'm not fully there yet until Christ. I can say when Christ has come again, that Christ has become all in all. And so the life of Christ and even the life of holiness and perfection is this ongoing call to confession, to repentance, and to continue to name the ways that life is not reflected Christ, and to continue to reevaluate and reorient my life towards Christ.
That's it. That's it. It's this idea of uh, disorientation and reorientation in Christ. This idea of uh, holiness is not only a crisis moment. It's a process of many crisis moments as we grow in Christ and we become more like Him. And I think something important with confession is that we need to be as contextual and honest as possible, especially when it comes to uh, confession in the church, this corporate confession. I think we need to do a better job at calling out the sins of the neighborhood, the sins of the street, the sins of our own county, and because so that we contextualize it. Because if you see the prophets, they were very contextual with the sins of those who they were confronting. And I think, for instance, in terms of us Black people, I think we need to confess the sin of tribalism and that we have. This idea that if I don't look like, if I don't dress certain way, if I don't talk certain way, I am not Black. This idea that somebody can be more Black than others. That is something that we need to confess, and we need to say this is because it continues to create. If you remember, Macmillan and Stevens, they at the beginning, Macmillan was like, "What are you doing over here, boy? I mean, you over there with your fancy suit from the north. This is the South. This is the South. You don't get us. You don't know. You know, you're not the same kind of Black man that I am. You know." So this idea, even though there may be an understanding, there is cultural differences. That doesn't make you any more Black or less Black than me.
Right.
You know, so I think we as Black people, we need to confess that. Now, how are there specific ways that white people, Levi, should confess publicly at church? And I know it's going to be very uncomfortable, but we are confessing this thing. We Black people confess this, and we white people confess this. But what do you think? What are some specific things that white people should confess together at church?
There's a lot. One of the things I think that we just need to begin confessing is that we live in a system, we live in a society, a nation that has been built on slavery. My family on my dad's side came to America. They landed in Hingham, Massachusetts in 1636. African Americans had already been brought over almost 20 years prior to my family being here. And we're latecomers in all of that regard. Native Americans were here far longer than that. And the ongoing story of America early on, I know we like to celebrate people like Thomas Jefferson, who said all men are created equal, but he also was an assimilationist who believed that Black people might be able to reach the status of being kind of almost white, their ability to be almost human. But if you remember in the Constitution, he writes that they're 3/5 of a human. The same thing is said of Native Americans, that they're savages in our Declaration of Independence. And so there's this, or not, excuse me, the Declaration, but the Constitution. So even in the kind of hopeful moments that we see in the nation, we still have to recognize that even those who would have this kind of high ideal, they're writing specifically for white men landowners. And so, we need to confess that we have a society that has often operated and benefited from the enslavement of other people. And I think as a church, we need to recognize we've participated in that. We've participated and supported things like apartheid in South Africa. And we had a segregated district in the Church of the Nazarene, and when that was taken away, instead of finding ways of promoting Black leadership, we basically just assimilated the leadership and silenced their voices. So even in trying to do good, sometimes we still didn't quite get it right. Now, that doesn't mean that people were always trying to be hateful. Sometimes they were trying to do the right thing and be helpful. But even in doing that, I think we can still say, we were wrong. That's okay. We can.
You can be rightly wrong. You can be genuinely wrong. That's the issue.
Yeah. So I don't think I think most people just don't want to be labeled racist because they don't want to be seen as hateful people. But it's not really just simply about hatred. It's about the kind of practices, the kind of policies, the kind of ideas that we have sometimes held and supported, and finding new ways of moving and learning and doing something different in our interactions. And so, I think what we need to understand, confession is not just simply saying we were wrong. Confession also then usually is prompted to say, okay, let's do something new, let's do something different in response to that. What kind of practices will replace those that have been deeply hurtful and problematic? And so, I think we need to continue to talk about the ways that we utilize power, the ways that our society utilizes violence, and the ways that the church has been silent, if not complicit in that. Because the ones who tend to get hurt the most are the most, the marginalized, the poor, and persons of color.
Absolutely. Well, we've been talking for about an hour. Time kind of flies by when we're talking. But we what a great conversation. What a great conversation. Thank you, Levi, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah, I appreciate it, guys. It was just good to listen. You had so many things going on, and you really covered it. And I think that as we continue these conversations and make space for people to have these conversations, which is important, we all come at it from different angles, different places, different different degrees on the spectrum. I remember what I was like 10 years ago and 20 years ago, and I've definitely grown and changed. And I think creating that safe conversation place and the ability to talk about this and learn from each other is just inherently Christian. So good work on that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good to be here.
Levi, come visit us, Oklahoma City.
I'd love to.
Get on down there. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next week, same time, same channel, and with the documentary, The House I Live In. So you'll kind of continue in some of these themes and really get into understanding some of the terrible systemic injustice that results from these things that we're talking about in racism and what we can do about it. Have a good one. Grace and peace to everyone. Talk